Foster. This is 5 o'clock at the Fosters. I started doing this show because I thought it'd be really fun to share my perspective on doing cocktails as a normal, everyday, average person. I thought it'd be really interesting to put my own personal spin on it, to sort of revive the love of classic cocktails. I saw a lot of videos on the internet, and they were done by professional bartenders doing professional things. It was sort of unapproachable to me as a normal, average, everyday person. Then I went to the other side of the spectrum and saw a lot of videos that were done by normal, average, everyday people, and they were doing kind of crazy cocktails. Well, I don't drink crazy cocktails. I drink normal, average, everyday cocktails. I drink Manhattans, I drink Old Fashions, I drink martinis, whiskey sours, gimlets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the reason why I'm doing this is to share that with everybody. When I started doing this, I also made a promise to myself. I personally am extremely opinionated, as most of my friends will be more than happy to tell everybody. But I promised that I would not be overly opinionated while I was doing this show. I wouldn't say this is the only way to do something or this is the right way to do it. I do have a few absolutes. I like to use fresh ingredients, not mixes. That's generally about the only absolute that I try to portray here. On the average, if a cocktail is a whiskey cocktail, you can use bourbon, you can use rye. If it calls for sugar, you can use simple syrup, or you can use crystallized sugar. You can do what you want with it. Sort of mix it up. You can add different bitters. You can add the fruits that you like. You can garnish it with whatever you like. I try really hard not to say this is the only way to do something. Well, I also ask people to tell me what cocktails they'd like to see. Well, several of my friends have started saying, "Hey, Gary, we want you to do an old-fashioned. We want you to do an old-fashioned." And I really think that, quite honestly, they're setting me up because they know that it's impossible for me to do a show on an old-fashioned cocktail without being opinionated. The old-fashioned cocktail is, by its very nature, an opinionated, curmudgeonly drink. And I'm sort of going to have to break my rule for this show, and I'm going to tell you some absolutes in this. I'm going to come across as if this is the only way to do it. Bear in mind that this is my opinion, and I'm not going to come to your house and I'm not going to yell at you if you decide to do something differently than I do. You're free to enjoy your cocktails however you want. But I do feel very strongly about this cocktail. I feel very strongly that there's only one right way to make it. I was recently at a bar and the bartender was telling me, yeah, I make the best old fashions in the world. Cool, make one for me. And he handed me his old fashioned cocktail, and he'd already done a couple what I consider cardinal sins with the old fashioned. A lot of those cardinal sins are very common nowadays. So before I get into what an old fashioned is, I'd like to talk a little bit about what an old fashioned is not. An old fashioned does not contain fruit. Not only does it not contain a fruit garnish, the traditional orange slice and maraschino cherry, you do not muddle the fruit with the cocktail. If you put it as a garnish, that's a minor sin. If you muddle the fruit with it, that is a major, major sin. You are so far off of what an old-fashioned cocktail really is that it's not even an old-fashioned. It's something completely different. So that's the first cardinal sin. The second cardinal sin is you do not top it off with water. You do not top it off with regular water, and you absolutely, positively do not add club soda to it. So as long as you remember those two things, then there are some riffs that you can do on an old-fashioned which put your own signature spin on it and don't really take it out of the realm. Unfortunately, the bartender that made me my old-fashioned, who was so proud of his old-fashioned, committed both those sins, and quite honestly, it was terrible. It was, at least how I consider an old-fashioned, it was terrible. An old-fashioned should be whiskey forward. You should taste the whiskey in it. It should be a cocktail that stands up and says, "Hey, I am not a fruit drink. I am not punch. I am whiskey. I am a whiskey cocktail." So now that I've talked about what's not in an old-fashioned, let's talk about what it is. An old-fashioned is an extremely traditional old-school cocktail. There's a reason why it's called the old-fashioned. An old-fashioned has only a few things in it. It has sugar, it has bitters, it has a splash of water, just a splash, just enough to help you dissolve the sugar, and then it has whiskey. And then you add your ice, you stir, and you let the ice melt a little bit to provide the dilution factor to tame the fire on the whiskey just a little bit. No garnish, no fruit, no topping it off with water. So I'm going to make for you what I consider the classic old-fashioned cocktail. So the very first thing you want to do is you start with a sugar cube. Do you have to start with a sugar cube? I do. You can use table sugar, you can use a spoonful of sugar, you can use simple syrup. I believe that it starts with a sugar cube. Angostura bitters. Angostura bitters, not any other kind of bitters. Angostura bitters. They're an aromatic bitter, and there's something magical about bitters. Some people I've heard say, oh, I don't like bitters, I don't like bitters. Well, that's like saying I don't like spice, I don't like salt, I don't like cinnamon, I don't like nutmeg in my pumpkin pies. This is the spice in a cocktail. You have to have this. There's something magical that happens when you add bitters to certain cocktails that ties all the ingredients together. And for this, if you don't have the bitters, your old-fashioned it's not going to taste right. It's going to taste quite terrible, actually. Now, I use about 3 or 4 dashes of Angostura bitters. You want to soak the sugar cube a little bit and drench it in the bitters. So now that you've got that in there, a little splash of water. The reason why you add a little splash of water to this is not to dilute the cocktail. The water helps you dissolve the sugar. Sugar will not dissolve well in high-proof alcohol, so you need a little bit of help. And you want the sugar in here to be dissolved before you add in the alcohol. Otherwise, you're just going to get sugar sitting on the bottom of your glass in your cocktail. Have you ever added a couple spoonfuls of sugar to cold iced tea and seen the way it just falls to the bottom, doesn't dissolve? It'll be sort of the same thing in your cocktail. And you need the sugar in this cocktail because it helps tame the fire of the whiskey just a little bit, and it helps tie everything together. So you can get a muddler, you can get a spoon, you can get a chopstick. It doesn't really matter what you use, but you need something that'll help you muddle that. So muddling is just basically you mix it until it's a paste. You mix it until the sugar is really well dissolved. Smash it up really good with the bitters and that splash of water. And make sure that there's very little of the sugar grains, none if possible, left in there. And that's another thing about an old-fashioned. An old-fashioned takes time. It takes time to do properly. So be prepared for that commitment. Okay, once it's dissolved in there, now what you're going to do is you're going to add your ice. You want enough ice to chill down the drink and to provide a little bit of dilution. Remember, this is where your dilution is going to come from. It's not going to come from topping it off with additional water. Now what you do, rye whiskey. Yes, you can use bourbon. I won't sneer at you if you use bourbon. I prefer to use rye. You do not use vermouth in this. You do not use anything other than rye or bourbon. It's not an old-fashioned if you do. 2 ounces of a good whiskey. And this is where it really counts to get a good whiskey for this. This cocktail is almost completely foolproof if you use a good rye or a good bourbon. Now you can see that the ice has already started to melt a little bit. You want to stir it up pretty good. Make sure that that bitter sugar paste at the bottom gets dissolved into the drink. Top it off with a little bit more ice. And what you have now is the basic old-fashioned. You can stop right here. This is it. This is done. You don't need to add anything else. You don't need to garnish it with fruit. You don't need to do anything else. This is the perfect old-fashioned. I, however, do one little tiny bit of a riff on it. What I like to do is I like to take just a little bit of an orange peel garnish. An orange twist. Now, making a twist is pretty easy. Grab an orange, lemon, lime, whatever you're using. Cut you off a chunk of it, right here. Now you'll see you'll have all this white stuff on the inside. That's called pith. This stuff tastes terrible. This stuff tastes pretty good. What you want to do is take this, and if you've ever filleted a fish, you're familiar with this, you're just going to take most of that white pith out, and you're going to leave just the rind behind. What you're going for here is when you look at the rind from where you've cut the pith off, you should see lots of little freckles on there where you can see the dimples of it coming through. Okay? Should have basically none of this stuff left on it. Now you've got a little chunk of orange peel here, just peel. Go ahead and cut a strip from that. You got a little strip. Do a twist. You'll get just a little bit of orange oil floating on the top of that cocktail. Take your twist, rub it around the rim of the glass, and drop it in. Now what that does is that gives you the aromatics of the orange. That orange oil, have you ever taken an orange peel and squeezed it and set it on fire and seen that orange oil sort of go into a candle? Well, that orange oil is very aromatic and it's very flavorful. You want just a little bit of that floating on top of this. You don't want to mix it in at this point. You want it floating on top so that when you drink it, it hits your nose. A cocktail is all about all the different senses. It's about taste, it's about sight, it's about smell, it's about, evoking all of these senses and evoking all of these memories. Well, if you're going to take the time to make a proper old-fashioned cocktail, then you should take the time to evoke as many of those senses as you can. So at this point, we have what I consider my perfect old-fashioned. To your health. Now, normally I stop right there. I'm going to follow it up a little bit. Once you've got the basic old-fashioned down and you've mastered the basic old-fashioned, and you can do this while you're talking to your guests or while you're not even thinking about it, you're just working away and you're making that cocktail and you can make it perfect every time, you can start putting your own signature spin on it. There's a couple of different things that I like to do or that I have tried. They do not involve adding fruit, so let's stop right there. But this is a perfect opportunity to start playing with different bitters. One of the things that I like to do is this Angostura bitters is called an aromatic bitter. There's a lot of different other types of bitters, and especially for this drink, orange bitters go really well. So at the point where you are making your paste, you're muddling your sugar and your bitters, you can add in a couple dashes of orange bitters to that. You can also add cherry bark or cherry vanilla bitters. You don't want to add too much because you don't want to overpower the Angostura bitters. In addition, what you can do is you can float those bitters on top of the drink. And you can float them there so that you get more of the aromatics from those bitters. That's another interesting way to do it. Another thing that I've done is I've seen people do this, and so I tried it myself. I take a nice large chunk of orange peel and I cut that just like I would if I were going to make a twist. I put it in after I've muddled the sugar and after I've put in the whiskey. I'll put the orange peel in and I'll muddle that a little bit. What that does is that releases a lot of the orange oils into the drink. There's a problem with that though. I like the taste of it. The taste is really, really strongly orange. It's a really good flavor and you don't get the sweet, sickly nature that you get if you get fruit in there. However, when you smell it when you're drinking it, it smells a little bit like furniture polish. It smells like orange furniture polish. So you got to kind of balance that. Are your smell really sensitive? Do you want that smell to it or not? Right now, stick with doing the basic old fashioned. The sugar cube, the bitters, splash of water, rye whiskey, ice. You're done. Once again, thank you, and to your health.